kemi pa humbur kohë, meqenëse humbëm mjaftueshëm me rregullimin teknologjik. Dhe është kënaqësi që hapim sesion të leksion të hapur, ku një herëzi prezantohet një ide, por një herëzi dhe një rrugtim i ri, i cili do filloj dhe pjesë e laboratorit të antropologjisë urbane tek Instituti i Antropologjisë, Kulturës dhe Studimeve të Arteve.
Mi mbrëma gjithë dhe, laboratori i antropologjisë urbane është konceptu si një qendër kërkimore pranë Institutit të Antropologjisë, Kulturës dhe Studimit të Artit. Për ata që kanë pak informacion për Institutit të Antropologjisë, Kulturës dhe Studimit të Artit, ajo është një institut pjesë e Akademisë së Studimeve Albanologjike, i përbërë nga 3 departamente klasike, po them tashmë, departamenti i folklorit, departamenti i arteve dhe departamenti i etnologjisë. Laboratori i antropologjisë urbane ka për qëllim të sjellë jo vetëm një grup ngushtë tashmë janë themelues, që janë dhe këtu të pranishëm, Ervin Kaqiu, Brinan Kollari, Olci Lelaj, Mikaela Minga, Junita Gashi, por është i hapur, besoj se s'kam haru njëri tjetër, është i hapur për shumë tjerë dhe nuk është çështje antarësie, se sa është një çështje e krijimit një qendre kërkimore e cila mundson sjelljen e perspektive të ndryshme mbi jetën urbane dhe mbi qytetin. Pse mbi qytetin, ndoshta është kaq të kot me thënë, por për 2 arsye, po i nënvizoj, për vetë bashkësinë e qytetit, ose të kryet qytetit, më së pari, edhe gjithë politikave mbi qytetin ushtruar prej qeverisë dhe prej veprimtarive tjera njerëzore mbi qytetin tonë, nëse është qyteti jonë, sepse nga një herë duke është sigur nuk marrim pjesë si qytetarën të. Nuk po hyj shumë me meditimet ose reflektimet e mia mbi qytetin, sepse nuk duhet të mbivendosen mendimet e mia gjithë laboratorit të antropologjisë urbane. Pasi ajo duhet me rrugë gjithmonë natyrën e lirisë plot akademike, gjithë secili prej nesh ftohet me hy në këtë laborator me perspektivën e vet kritike, çmtuese mbi jetën. Por i rrim idesë që ajo çfarë e legjitimoj përfundimisht ose e legjitimoj më shumë se asnjë gjë tjetër shkencat humane, është pyetja çfarë na bën ne të jetojmë bashkë ose si duhet jetojmë bashkë. E qyteti është një vend ku duhet me shtu pyetjen pse jetojmë bashkë. Akset kërkimore që ne kemi propozuar janë disa, po ato krejt negociueshme brenda laboratorit të antropologjisë urbane. Kur them të negociueshme në kuptimin më të plot fjalës, ato janë si propozime, por nuk janë si finalitete, dhe secili autor ruan krejt drejtën e vet për ta quajtur analizën dhe shqyrtimin dhe reflektimet e veta aty ku e mendon dhe si e sheh dhe si e propozon mendimin dhe veprën e vet, por po e them me lejen tuaj to pika dhe për ta mbyllur dhe unë për mos u zgjat shumë, se besoj që është shumë për të folë, por edhe për ta lëm, do ta lëm si projekt që duhet mu bë. Pika e parë, shkrijimi i zonave të reja të banimit informale, formale dhe politika shtetërore, varfëria urbane, tendencat ghettoizuese të shtresave më të marginalizuara të shoqërisë, ekonomia politike apo ekonomitë politike të proceseve të njohura si legalizuese, fjala vjen legalizimi i shtëpiave, politikat mbi pronën e bashkësive fetare e tjerë, 4. Politika shtetërore mbi estetiken dhe turistifikimin e hapësirës urbane, kultura re urbane në fokus të kultura legale, me një fokus specifik të kultura legale dhe politike. Këto janë si thash, si shina e dashje pa dashje, do shkojmë drejt një pyetje etike dhe teorike. A do të kemi të bëjmë, a kemi, fakt, unë do të formuloj kështu, a kemi komoditetin me bë studime në një shoqëri si e jona që jeton në kushtin e jashtëzakonshëm si normalitet, me bë një antropologji të shpenguar ose të shkujdesur pa ndonjë shqetësim të bashkohores dhe publikës. Pra, a kemi komoditetin të rrim në një pozicion komod që mos të angazhohemi në shoqëri dhe mos të angazhohemi publikisht për çfarë shqetëson veten tonë si qytetar, apo çfarë shqetëson shoqërinë ku ne jetojmë. Personalisht, po prapë i rri qëndrimit krejt personale, pa ju mbevendos askujt, mendoj se nuk e kemi komoditetin të rrim të paangazhuar. Angazhimi pastaj është çështje krejt personale. Kjo fund mund të vrasin gjithë çfarë thash kur them që është krejt personale, por që është një vend për të matur, dhe unë shpresoj shumë që laboratori antropologjisë urbane të jetë një vend ku ne do sfidohemi për njëri tjetrin edhe për këtë anë etike përveç anës teorike. Në fund do falenderoj disa persona dhe institucione shkurtimisht. Do falenderoj shumë Brina Hënkollarin, Adi Sheun, Vinka Qiun, por specifikisht do falenderoj shumë Olci Lelaj, se ka bërë shumë punë për me ndodhë ky aktivitet sot. Uroj që mos të kem hykujt në hak, sigurisht gjithë stafit Institutet Antropologjisë që punojnë, në kushte jo shumë komode, për shumë arsye, që janë kryesisht përgjegjësi e qeverisë tonë, që nuk janë kushtet minimale për punë, por më tepër dhe bashkë shoqërohemi në një ndërtim të ri, ngjitur me ne, që shkatrohet një hapësirë që ka qenë Muzeu i Natyrës, por dhe na sulmon ne çdo ditë me zhurmën, shkatrimin dhe gjallëninë e ndërtimit që ndodh aty. Falenderoj Gerin që na është bashku. Falenderoj shumë Performin, Berinën, Fanin, që ka qenë inkurajuese derisa është bërë mundshme organizimi i këtij takimi dhe disa takime që do ndodhin nën City Methodologies, që është një fluks teorik, ftesë teorike brenda laboratorit të antropologjisë urbane dhe një projekt në vetvete brenda këtij konteksti. Dhe në fund falenderoj Akademinë e Shkencave që nuk na u bë as pak pengesë për punën e shkret e hapur që ne të ishim këtu bashkë. Edhe falënderimi i fundit është për gjithë ju që jeni këtu. Uroj që t'ja kaloj mirë edhe të kemi mundësi që diskutojmë edhe me shpresën që se kam tepruar me fjalën time, duke munduar me qenë shkurtër e mori kohën e vet, për arsye ndoshta tradite. Faleminderit shumë.
Thank you very much also for the invitation to come to Tirana and give a talk about the topic that I'm quite passionate about. So what I'm going to do really is talk you through some of the ideas that are central to the book that I edited now around 1.5 years ago. It was published and it's called Engaged Urbanism. I think here you have it, which is a book that has a kind of a long history, you could argue, because it started off in 2009. I will say a few words more a bit later, and sort of signaled the beginning of my interest in cities, in let's say in post-socialist or in the former socialist parts of Europe. I must say, first of all, that my interest in cities is a relatively recent one. I mean, I am already working 30 years in the region, initially particularly working on issues of ethnic conflict and war and violence in the cases of Kosovo and Bosnia. And so I have also written a book on Kosovo, for instance, a book on the Srebrenica massacre. And this research on cities is actually sort of a third major theme in my work. And I've developed this also because I didn't want sort of to continue during the rest of my career dealing with very tough topics such as genocide and war crimes as they happened in the former Yugoslavia, and I turned to, let's say, urban topics where I felt there was there was a potential there for me also to contribute with a more future-oriented approach. So, you know, applying my own science, which is anthropology, in a field, let's say in the urban studies field, where I felt that people like me, but of course also other urban disciplines, could contribute to creating better cities to live in, fairer cities to live in. I mean, that's the title also of the introduction of this book. And my talk today is actually a talk not necessarily catering only for anthropologists. So I've written this presentation. Actually, also the introduction to the book is a text, is an attempt to, let's say, define forms of engaged urbanism for a very interdisciplinary audience. So that's the audience I'm addressing. What is important, I would say, is that I want to insert my own discipline, anthropology, into this wider field of urban studies, especially also, I feel, because anthropology has been rather marginal in this very particular field of urban studies, which is dominated by geographers, architects, urban planners, I mean, and sociologists, just to name I think the most important disciplines that are sort of involved in the urban studies fields. So after my work in the former Yugoslavia, I started doing research in Bucharest since about 2009-10. And I soon, while doing this research in the city of Bucharest, which is it's a large city, as you probably know, I also started to reflect on what one could do in a city as an anthropologist. Anthropologists are usually very much attuned to small settings like villages or particular, let's say, parts of a city. I wanted to embrace the city as a whole, and I started to think also about what one could do anthropologically or ethnographically to work in a large city such as Bucharest. So this was the beginning, let's say, of an interest in methodology also. To what extent do ethnographic methods or anthropological fieldwork methods actually work in a large context? So I started to reflect on this, and I started to organize a number of events which were particularly focusing on methodological issues of urban research. So my wish to adapt anthropological methods to the city, and actually also to push the boundaries of urban research and, let's say, explore new and innovative methods, resulted in a project which I called Cities Methodologies. This was an interdisciplinary event, the concept of which I developed in 2009. So that was about the time that I was starting my research in Bucharest also. And this grew into an annual event organized by the UCL Urban Laboratory, so University College London, where I was employed up till 2014. In 2009, the first edition happened of this particular event, and here you see a few posters of this UCL Urban Laboratory Cities Methodologies for a number of years. The left one is the first edition that I organized together with an artist. Apart from these 6 or 7 editions in London, I also organized a Cities Methodologies in Bucharest in 2010, when I was living in Bucharest for a year. together with a number of Romanian colleagues. So what does this project do? Cities Methodologies is a kind of a hybrid format, if you can say it like this. So it showcases in the form of an exhibition, combined with talks and debates, ways in which people that work in cities, practitioners that are active in particular disciplines, interested in cities, how they approach the city in practical methodological terms. So it's really looking at, and the emphasis is on the methods used. So how is the research done? And in each of these editions, we basically did an open call for people to come forward with particular projects that they had done in which they were applying sort of new, innovative ways of doing urban research. And then we selected the best projects that had applied to participate in this edition of that particular year. And although contributions came from many disciplines, let's say right across the built environment, the arts and the humanities, the social historical sciences, it was artists that took center stage at the event, and that was a very deliberate, conscious decision. I wanted it to be like that because I thought artists often have a very specific, a very personal, a very intuitive and idiosyncratic way of exploring the city. And that is, in my view, a major source of inspiration from which innovation may come. So I think that the work of artists, it can be very important for us to explore cities and urban realities in new ways. And this whole project started actually with a small problem or a dilemma. I had received a bit of money, really a very small research grant in 2009 from the UCL Arts and Humanities faculty to develop something around the topic of cities. I teamed up with John Aiken, who was the director of the UCL's Slade School of Fine Arts at the time. And in the discussion with him, so the discussion between an anthropologist and an artist, let's say, this event took place. So one of the tasks for us was to create an inventory of work that had been done at the university, and particularly within the Arts and Humanities faculty. We wanted to invite, let's say, collaborators from all corners of the university who have an interest in urban studies. The problem was that this faculty was a very interdisciplinary sort of environment. So where there were very different regional interests, such as, let's say, Eastern Europe or Latin America or America. Then there were a number of different disciplines involved, let's say, from literature to film studies, from philosophy to the arts. So it was a very diverse, let's say, population in the faculty, and to get everybody under the same common denominator proved very difficult. So it was not really possible to bring all strands of urban research done at UCL and the faculty, Arts and Humanities faculty, together under one overarching theme. And so the idea emerged out of, let's say, needs, out of having no other options, to focus on methodologies, an aspect that I thought all research shares, all people working in a variety of disciplines share. So in whatever discipline you work, everybody uses a method. Whether we do that in a very conscious manner or in an unreflected manner, whether we experiment or use them as a matter of habit or disciplinary convention. But methods we have. There is always a method that is a way doing, let's say, the inquiry, of doing the work of an academic investigation. Scholars and also artists use methods. They gather data, they gather visual sources, let's say, through systematic encounters with their object, which is the city, and they always implicitly or explicitly employ a set of tools that is practical, often conventional steps to gather these data, images, or other material. So the questions that we then put at the center of cities methodologies were, how do researchers and artists approach and tackle the city as an entity of research and exploration? Through which prisms do they look at urban realities? What do they do? How do they work? Where do they look for the data that they need? What mistakes do they make? And how do they make their hands dirty in terms of the practical choices they make in the process of data gathering and the collection of visual sources? And finally, how do they, at the end of this research trajectory, let's say, process the data and materials they gather into formats that communicate their ideas and findings to a wider audience? So the idea was to draw the attention away from the kind of polished and processed final products, the end products of urban research, even though they remain a crucial point of reference in the project, let's say, but to rather focus on the processes and the practices and how these outcomes are achieved through forms of error and trial, through forms of experimentation. So this event has been organized, I mean, the last edition was in 2016. So it was organized in a number of consecutive years in London as well as in Bucharest. And then in 2013, we decided to bring the most interesting projects together in a book, which some of you may have seen, I believe. So, and instead of taking you through the individual contributions, there's a variety of contributions. These are not sort of conventional academic texts. These are short pieces with a lot of visual materials in which the contributors talk about how their project evolved, what they've done, what was innovative about what they were doing. And so instead of talking you through all these individual contributions, I think there's around 35 of them in the book, I will actually focus on what is shared across these contributions. So what are the common themes and what is the common denominator of the book? My co-editor, Ben Kempkin, and myself, we actually arrived at formulating these ideas only having only after having looked carefully, at all the different selected projects. So much of what I will have to say is based on a kind of inductive process. So first looking closely at the different key contributions before analyzing the things they share. So what I'm going to do now is to provide you with a kind of a list of themes that have come out of doing this project for 7-8 years, going through 7-8 editions, having dozens, if not hundreds, of contributions and contributors to the project, and you know what these projects have in common or share. Of course, what I'm going to list now is not always shared by all the texts in the book. So this is a kind of list of themes that can be found in a critical mass of a number of texts, let's say. So first of all, I would say one of the things that have come out of this project is a kind of realization and acknowledgement that cities, towns, and urban sites are very diverse, specific, unique, and changeable. So it is better to speak of individual cities with their own specific historical trajectories and current characteristics, instead of assuming a kind of generalized, globalized, and uniform condition of urbanization. And this is, of course, obvious, I would say, and unnecessary to say in front of an audience of anthropologists. Anthropologists generally being very well aware of and attuned to the social and cultural diversity that exists in the world. But this may not be so obvious for practitioners of other urban disciplines who may be much less sensitive to cultural and variety and diversity. I'm aligning myself with the work of a former colleague at UCL, Jennifer Robinson, who some of you may know, quite a well-known urban geographer nowadays, who also was a member of the UCL Urban Laboratory. And she's become very well-known for her post-colonial, decentered and empirically based comparative urbanism. Her ideas have been a source of inspiration, especially since her approach allows, in my view, although she doesn't say this so explicitly, for a more, let's say, prominent role of anthropology and ethnography in the urban studies field. So what she is saying, and what many contributors in the book are saying, is that all cities are different, really. Yeah? So they develop themselves in various ways at different points in time, under the influence of a wide range of factors such as economic and political developments, historical experiences such as wars or changing political regimes, factors such as rural-urban migration and demographic changes. And the list can be made much longer. In my view, the concept of path dependency is a very suitable one in this context for a better understanding of particular urban realities. It accounts for the existing diversity and different historical trajectories of individual cities. Perhaps I should give you one example of how this could look like, looking at sort of urban phenomena as not uniform, but rather diverse across different cities. And I'll give you perhaps an unusual example, and that's the example of traffic. So urban traffic, which is one of my interests. It seems to be kind of a constant feature of whatever city you're in, with people using similar vehicles and streets where particular universal signage is used, where particular technological devices are used that have reached, let's say, all corners of the world to regulate traffic, flows of traffic. In my view, however, I would say that every city has its own traffic culture. It has its own history of how these traffic flows or let's say traffic phenomena in the city have developed, which means that there are differences. Sometimes the differences are very easy to recognize. Sometimes they are smaller or even minute. One has to really look well to see these differences in terms of how people navigate the city, what vehicles they use, how they negotiate with other participants in traffic, at what speed they travel, for instance, and how they negotiate their movements with others. In traffic, strangers constantly interact with one another, subscribing or not, or only partly, to a kind of shared code of conduct, a kind of social etiquette, an unwritten but negotiated set of rules of how to interact in public areas or on the streets. And there are various factors, I think, or conditions which determine and influence this specific local traffic culture or the codes of public conduct in a particular city, such as the geographic terrain, the weather, the density of the urban environment, the morphological characteristics of the built environment, the vehicles people use, or the different mix of vehicles that one can find in a city, the regulations imposed by the state and the local authorities, the way the police intervenes or not in cases of transgression of traffic rules. So this is just one example. I think that in order to capture this particular variety of urban phenomena, we can talk about a lot of other issues about traffic, we need methodological flexibility, responding to the specific situations and new issues of particular cities, and capture the variety of urban sites and experiences across time and space. Variety also exists across time, so diachronically. Certain developments have fundamentally changed the outlook and the rules of conduct in the city. For recent decades, one may think of, for example, the explosive growth of car mobility in cities in Eastern Europe, or the introduction of the mobile phone, and later the internet in an urban context, which has changed the ways in which people move through the city, how they relate to each other, how they inhabit public spaces, and how they communicate. So in order to be sensitive to these particularities and developments, it could be beneficial, and that's one other key point of the book, to stop or suspend for a moment this totalizing sort of, these totalizing grand theories so commonly produced in many disciplines, and to be more open and perceptible to the newly emerging empirical realities. So this is where this concept of situated comes from. That's in the title of the introduction to the book. We feel, and with us a lot of other contributors to the book feel, that we need sort of fine-grained, grounded, empirical research that adapts itself to and is sensitive to local contexts. So these are some key points for the beginning. We also will sort of get back to Jenny Robbins' ideas. We also need to be less rigid with concepts. So if I'm saying we should perhaps stop or suspend the use of grand theories, one other element of what we're trying to say is that one should be less rigid and more flexible with the use of particular concepts. As Jenny Robinson helpfully argues, there is a need for developing local, flexible, and provisional concepts that may change over time, that if applied across different cases, they may get different contents, they may also get different names, let's say, and so concepts are not set in stone. Concepts can change across time and space. So Jennifer Robinson argues against the dominant and hegemonic circuits of knowledge, which usually emerge in the dominant sites of urban theorizing, such as New York and London, for example. And she argues for what she calls thinking with variation, or thinking with elsewhere. What methodologies tries to do is to reflect on and assess critically existing urban research methodologies. So that's one of the key, let's say, aims of the project. Being concerned with methodological and practical decisions, improvisations, negotiations that take place, the kind of protocols researchers develop to, let's say, gather data, to consolidate data, how to write them down, how to capture them, how to process them, how to analyze them. There are all sorts of protocols that you can use for this. Practices through which insights are arrived at and knowledge is produced. In the city's methodologies event, we we have always been in favor of testing new and innovative and experimental urban research strategies, which are open-ended in analytical as well as in theoretical terms, and push the traditional boundaries of disciplines. So, as I already said at the beginning, it is important to acknowledge that every city, every urban site, every emerging urban issue may need its own method of exploration, its own methodological toolbox. And that's why we've chosen, or we are using, cities, methodologies, both terms in the plural. And that's quite a key element of the book, let's say, to use these two terms in the plural. Cities are diverse, and also methodologies are diverse. And each city can be some sort of a laboratory to develop particular approaches to studying particular topics that may be very salient in a particular city. And I can't really sort of say for a city like Tirana what may be very specific for this city, but I can give you a few examples, for instance, for Bucharest. What I've found particularly interesting or striking in a city like Bucharest, which is perhaps specific for Bucharest, not always, but which somehow has put a stamp on the, let's say, the identity of the city, the life that has evolved in the city. And these are topics that are very concrete and, topics that I've been exploring in my fieldwork. So an example is, for instance, a particular edifice. Like, I don't know whether, how many of you know the House of the People in Bucharest, which is a large palace that was built by Ceausescu in the 80s. If you've never been to Bucharest, you probably cannot imagine how large this building is. It's the second largest building in the world, after the Pentagon, and Ceausescu destroyed 20 to 25%, of the old city, demolished it, just bulldozering it to a surface on which the palace could be built, displacing around 40,000 people. So it's a major edifice in a city like Bucharest. It has had an enormous impact on the lives of people. And I would say this is a specific of Bucharest. This is a building that you find in Bucharest that's quite unique in its scope, in its size, in its effects, and in its contemporary role still. So it is still a very important building in terms of being the seat of the Romanian parliament, but also of a number of other organizations, such as some special security forces, the Constitutional Court, Interpol. It's an enormous building. There's a Museum of Contemporary Art at the back of the building. So the building, I would say, is an interesting aspect of Bucharest, and whether you like it or not, it has had a major effect on the city, on its population. Another interesting aspect of Bucharest, which is perhaps not so specific for Bucharest, but which you also can find in other cities, is the ubiquity of stray dogs, which you find, of course, in a lot of different cities in Eastern Europe. In Bucharest, they have now largely disappeared, but let's say during the 90s especially, and into the 2000s, this was a very important, I would say, element of the social fabric of the city. People lived with dogs around them all the time, were using the dogs as guarding dogs for their houses or for particular neighborhoods. And so this is an element which I think deserves also special attention. When you want to know how a city like Bucharest, how the clock ticks in a city like Bucharest. You have to keep an eye for these things. Another thing that struck me while I was living and working in Bucharest is sort of the abundant presence of flower booths. So on each street corner you could buy flowers, and I spare you the details. Perhaps we can speculate on why Bucharest has so many flower booths. It's a trade that's particularly done by Roma people, so it's almost a trade that is monopolized by Roma. And in my attempts to understand why this is such a ubiquitous phenomenon in the city, I've developed some assumptions, but it's very hard to lay a finger on it. Then another really an interesting aspect, and I know quite a lot of cities in Eastern Europe that have a similar presence of private security companies, but in Bucharest, I would say there is such an overabundance of private security companies present on public spaces and public streets that it also kind of asks for a special explanation. And this ubiquity of private security in the city, of course, has a special effect on the city and on the social fabric of the city. And then last but not least, this is another sort of pet project of mine, where I try to understand the, let's say, the specifics of Bucharest as a city is the ring road, the Centura, which is a remnant of the pre-socialist periods. It's a kind of infrastructural and metaphorical construct that has developed over time and is also very present in the imagination of the city as a peripheral zone of the city, where all sorts of things happen that can't be seen in proper daylight, let's say. So these are a number of examples through which I can, you could argue these are kind of elements of a unique constellation that Bucharest is. Yeah? So that's what I wanted to explain, that for each city that we're interested in, we may actually able to develop certain similar lists of features, of aspects, of characteristics, of elements that are key in the city. Now, in terms of diachronical diversity, I think that one of the things that one could try to capture is indeed also forms of, let's say, recent developments that have happened in different parts of Eastern Europe. And these are, let's say, phenomena like the rise of homelessness, the emergence of ghettos, the rise of people working in very precarious conditions, especially also elderly people, which are particular phenomena that can be said to be characteristic for, let's say, a new historical era in which we are, and that need to be addressed and investigated through methods that need to be tailored to these specific situations or these specific problems and issues that have arisen in the city. In the book, we also point at the importance of thinking about audiences, thinking about dissemination of research. So, for whom do we do the research? To whom do we communicate the research, and how do we do that? What sort of new media do we use? And there is a variety of projects in the book that use kind of innovative ways of of communicating and disseminating particular findings. So new strategies of presentation and communication. Do we as academics can we only publish in refereed journals, which are only read by a very select group of academics and colleagues, if they have access at all, because of the growing paywalls of all sorts of journals? Or do we try to connect to a wider general audience through, for example, blogs or giving talks like I'm doing now? I can give you another example of sort of an experimental strategy that I've myself developed, and that's a project that is called the Night Laboratory. It's a project that doesn't necessarily feature in the book, but it's something I've been developing over a number of years, where I've been writing and doing research about night shift workers in different cities, like London, but also in other cities like Moscow, Sofia, New York. And I write, so I kind of do field work at night, which is a kind of an experimental step to take. So I'm on the street with one or two colleagues, talking to people who are working at night. Yeah? And on the basis of the materials, the things we hear and the situations we encounter, I then write very brief vignettes of a maximum of 200 words. This is a completely random limit of words I've set myself. But it's a small piece of text, very condensed, very brief, something you can read in a matter of a minute. And I put it online in a blog, which makes it accessible for a much larger audience. This is absolutely not academic writing, but it's more like an impressionistic, very hyper-realistic small piece about a person working at night. This is an example, let's say, of things we could do. You know, we don't need to do only, write only sort of text for academic journals. Apart from thinking about dissemination and how we publish our research, let's say, I think it's also important to question the established methodological habits. I can give you again the example of my nighttime research. Many anthropologists, in fact, take it for granted that you do anthropological field work during the day. That's the time when people are up and work, have family lives and all of this. But what if we just turn this around and say, okay, why not as an anthropologist choose the night as our zone of field research? And that's a step I've taken. It's actually sort of question or turning around established practices and do something that has unpredictable results, let's say. You don't know exactly what will come out of it, but an established practice is actually changed. So instead of diurnal fieldwork during the day, one can do fieldwork during the night. One could try and see how the city looks at that time of the day, what kind of people inhabit the city, and why are they there. In the book, we also argue for what we call sort of unregimented or undisciplined types of research. So types of methods or practices that do not fit the, let's say, the normal conventional methods that are used in disciplines. We think it's important to test and try these kind of undisciplined or unregimented practices. So what happens when I do this or that, adopt this or that strategy? What kind of material is produced and what new questions may emerge? New types of research may emerge through forms of experimentation without a clear and preconceived idea what the outcomes will be. I would say this is perhaps an inversion of the usual and dominant research practice in the social sciences, where the researcher first establishes the topic to do research about, then defines the main research question as well as a hypothesis, then decides about how to go about gathering the necessary data, what methods to use to be able to answer the questions. In most of the social sciences, especially in quantitative research, this is quite a rigorous, structured, and mechanical process which is designed to produce viable and representative data. Of course, I do not want to dismiss these standards or conventional methodological approaches, but I do believe that there should be room for experimentation. There should be sort of a room for freedom in terms of what kind of methods or approaches or protocols to adopt. Okay, so still a few other sort of common themes in the book is the emphasis on methods that sort of go beyond the visual. So we are aiming at breaking the hegemony of visual representations, which is very dominant in urban studies, I would say, and embarking upon the study of embodied practices, interrogating the material and also the immaterial dimensions of the city. So the city being sort of a multi-sensory, tactile environment. One essay in the book, and now I'm mentioning one of the particular contributors, is Andrew Stevenson. For example, he shows what it means for new arrivals in a city, new migrants coming to a city, in this case Manchester, what it means for those people to navigate and to physically navigate a new city that is unfamiliar, an unfamiliar material and tactile reality for these new arrivals, with various barriers, sounds, smells, etc. And what it triggers in these people, for example, in terms of memories of other places that they have inhabited before and with which they are much more familiar. Andrew Stevenson let his informants choose the methods to document their perception of the city of Manchester. So instead of imposing on them a particular method of documenting how they navigate the city, of how they perceive the city, he was thinking initially of using photography for this. Yeah? So again, a sort of a visual method. In the end, he decided to let his main informants, his key informants, decide what kind of methods to use in representing their own experiences of the city. And this was, of course, of key relevance also for one of his informants who was a blind person, where photography, of course, absolutely doesn't work. Yeah? So all these different strategies people use in documenting the sounds, the tactile experiences of the city can be found in Stevenson's text, for instance. Another idea that took shape in the book was this idea of the urban street. The urban street as a kind of very interesting metaphor for urban life. Celebrating the urban street as a setting for unpredictable encounters with the potential to accommodate diversity and produce all sorts of creative friction. Providing the conditions of what Ed Soja has called cynicism, this kind of positive energy and innovative synergy that arises from proximity, from people living together in a very dense urban space. A clustering of people produces all sorts of effects, and this is of course characteristic for an urban environment. Then the next point is the work of artists. I've already mentioned it. So the work of artists has been a particular source of inspiration in the project. So in each of the editions we have invited artists to come and present their work at Cities Methodologies events in order for us to get inspired, let's say, to bring about innovation in urban research. Artists tend to explore cities, as I already said, in a more improvised, playful, idiosyncratic manner. Their work is often experimental, with the emphasis put on just doing something out of the ordinary, applying a certain procedure or protocol without knowing what the actual outcome will be. And I'm just about to publish a text about the House of the People, the big palace in Bucharest. A text on how to capture ethnographically this building and the people that inhabit it and use it. Which was a struggle. How do you write, let's say, ethnographically about a totalitarian edifice? And in this text I've been using the work of artists intensively. This is a building that you could argue has been traumatic for Bucharest, and this building has produced a lot of artistic work that is critical of this particular edifice. And artists have done all sorts of things, let's say, to articulate the pain the building has caused, let's say, the consequences the building has had. And I've used this artistic work as a source of inspiration for my ethnographic work. I can go into detail, if you like, a bit later. Perhaps a last point I would like to make before I finish is the use of performative strategies. So one of the key elements that comes out of the book is the importance of performative strategies, and I've also worked out this idea in the introduction. So, of course, this has to do with forms of engagement in an urban environment. Engagement can, of course, take very different forms. One can think of activism, one can think of performances, intervention, etc., in an urban context. And in my, let's say, treatment of this particular aspect of urban research, I've pleaded for the use of sort of situationist principles. So the situationist, the French situationist from the 60s, as a tool of urban research. For example, when I participate in traffic in Bucharest, I try to create all sorts of situations or complications. In very practical situations, I try to, let's say, participate in traffic, creating situations that I'm curious about how people will resolve these situations. And Tirana is a very similar, attractive city to do these type of things, I believe. Although the city is also very intimidating. You have a question?
I don't mean to interrupt, but do you have an example of that?
An example may be that instead of feeling very daunted by a intersection where there is a chaos of cars trying to negotiate their passage through the intersection, my initial reaction was indeed, you know, for God's sake, how I'm going to manage to get through here. And in the years, through the years, I've actually started enjoying these situations and just move in with the car and find a way through and see how communication works between the different participants in this cluster of cars. I mean, Bucharest is in some intersections are absolutely chaotic. I mean, the situation has been regulated more and more, I can say. But in the first years that I was in Bucharest, some squares, like Victoria Square, which is a huge square, there were no lines, no indications where the road actually was, and it was one big sea of cars. And in these kind of situations, I do try to create trouble, if you can put it like this. By entering in these situations without, let's say, fear. Just to see, I mean, you know, I've learned that in Bucharest people kind of negotiate these situations and find solutions. Does that answer somehow your question? Because there may be other situations, for instance, I'm using different vehicles, yeah, so not just cars, but also bicycles. I mean, I'm cycling a lot in the city, and also there you can kind of see how car drivers, for instance, respond to your behavior as a cyclist, particularly in situations of congestion. So there are all sorts of moments in which you can argue that you can perform a particular role or can perform a particular behavior in a public sort of street situation in order then to see how the reaction of people will be. What kind of reactions, responses it triggers. These performative strategies, they may also mean adopting roles and what I call alter egos. So these are also, this is also part of producing situations, but here rather in non-traffic situations, but for instance in other situations. I can give you one example. For instance, one of the projects I've been working on for 2 years or so is, I mean, my main interest is social inequality and particularly also the nouveau riche in Bucharest, so the very wealthy segment of society. And one of the fieldwork projects I did was doing fieldwork in luxury shops, where I would enter with a friend of mine who looked like a well-dressed gentleman. I was looking more like somebody who was in need of a serious makeover. We entered the shop. I mean, we're really talking about the most expensive shops in Bucharest, with this kind of small performance of an English-speaking couple of 2 men, one dressed very well, the other looking like he needed advice. And then my colleague, who indeed knows a lot about these particular items, would indeed sort of take me to, let's say, a few expensive watches and tell me a lot about the sort of detailed features of these watches. He indeed knows a lot about these things, so the response of the staff in these shops is usually, this is a serious client, potential client. These are people that are not just coming in like that. And this is a strategy, I would say, that worked very well. So we have had situations in which we entered the shop and where we then entered into a discussion, a conversation of 2-3 hours, where even let's say, the shop owners closed the shop to engage with us in a discussion. This sounds like very unexpected that this can happen, but this has been the experience. I mean, we usually very quickly say that we're researchers and that we're interested to talk to them about, let's say, their trades. But it allows me, for instance, to ask all sorts of questions about who their clients are, how they consider the behavior of these clients who often come in with a lot of cash, but with no knowledge about the value of these items. But there were really interesting conversations we had about this. So this is another example, I think, of a fieldwork situation where you kind of trigger a fieldwork sort of fieldwork interaction through a small performance. And I use this kind of concept of alter egos in this context. I think we all have different identities. We all form composites of different sides of ourselves. And in our research, we can actually mobilize these different sides of ourselves. So I'm not saying we should produce sort of fake personas in the research we do, but we can actually mobilize particular aspects of ourselves in the interaction we have with relevant others in the city. So in my research, I, for instance, used my role as a parent tourist. I've used my role as a person interested in post-traumatic stress disorder to get into the House of the People when there was the World Psychiatry Convention. And this is a genuine interest I have because of my research in Bosnia. I've worked a lot with traumatized people. I've presented myself also as a cyclist activist, which I am. I'm not only an academic, I'm also adamant about, that bicycles are an important way of improving life in cities. And my role as an academic is just, let's say, part of that set of qualities or set of identities that I combine. And I think in our urban research we can actually use these different sides of ourselves, which I call alter egos. I don't know, I think my time is over more or less. Or yeah, so yeah, there's a few things perhaps. These I've already mentioned. Another element that is dealt with in the book by some people is the importance of the past and of memories. So I do believe this is an important topic, also for anthropologists, because people live in cities with their memories. Memories in urban spaces, having memories in urban spaces that may change very fast. So we think that in the book, or we proclaim in the book, that commemorating urban pasts is important because it is at the same time, or it allows at the same time for a kind of reimagination of urban futures. So if we can think of how a city worked in the past, this can also be a recipe for how it may work in the future. And so it is important to document change, document the memories of change, the interventions that have happened in the contemporary city, including the kind of erasures, the absences, the spatial cleansing that has taken place. So the evictions of people from particular neighborhoods is, I think, worth looking at closely. Tapping into people's memories, for example, people who've become the victim of forms of spatial cleansing, who've been evicted from their homes, to make way for new developments in the city. For example, in a central city neighborhood such as in Bucharest, the authorities collaborated with developers and planned a new big boulevard, a thoroughfare through the center of the city, causing a lot of protests and also people still talking about this as one of the scandals in a city like Bucharest. So this is, I think it's important to look at these historical developments. So, and at the very end, I'm not very good in coordinating my talk with the PowerPoint. I hope you forgive me for that. At the end, I would say that the book ends really with a plea for engaged forms of research, so engaged forms of urbanism, that employs creative, imaginative, interactive and participatory methods that protect the interest of vulnerable categories of people. It challenges established research and urban design methods and practices in order to include peripheral voices, hidden and silenced voices and perspectives, for example, of people who were evicted from city centers, like is happening in many places of Southeastern Europe. And so engagement also means the employment of alternative, of innovative, unconventional methods that will allow us to insert sort of local, subjective, quirky bits of knowledge into the vestiges of objective and hegemonic knowledge. So I think one of the aims of the book is to kind of, as you can see on this image, this is an image, I mean all the images are from the book, but this is an image of a project where overwriting hegemonic knowledge is one of the things we try to do. Overwriting hegemonic knowledge produced by experts and specialists. Thank you very much for your attention.